Tariffs were recently lifted against Canada and Mexico, clearing the way for a new trade agreement to be brought up in Congress. But did you know that if it passed, America will be just another brick in the globalist NWO wall? We'll hit that today in this episode of Analysis Behind the News, where we provide the perspective that you can use to help save American liberty and independence. The Political Morning Trade newsletter reported last week that the renegotiated free trade agreement for the 3 North American countries was headed for a standoff between President Trump and House Democrats. They also reported that VP Mike Pence told reporters in Florida that the lifting of the steel and aluminum tariffs has cleared the way now for Congress to take this up and bring USMCA to vote. Of course, USMCA being the name of the renegotiated trade deal, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. Now, Trump appears happy with it. Many of the GOP are happy with it, but congressional Democrats want the agreement to go further by protecting labor standards, environmental provisions, access to medicines, and enforcement of these issues. However, no one should be happy with this agreement, and it should be immediately scrapped. Why? First of all, where in the Constitution did the states grant the federal government the power to legislate labor standards, or environmental provisions, or access to medicines? Just because the federal government is involved in those areas now does not mean they have the constitutional power to do so. You will not find those powers listed in there, especially in Article 1, Section 8, which lists the enumerated powers for Congress. Next, if 3 countries have entered into an agreement, then what entity will be charged with enforcing that agreement? Years ago, agreements were left to each country to follow to the best of their ability, or they would take the chance of getting kicked out of their agreement. Nowadays, international bodies are used to enforce the agreement, including judicial tribunals and other layers of unaccountable government bureaucracy above that of each country's government. Yet, if our Constitution doesn't grant the power to legislate specific areas that these agreements are covering, then why in the world would we want to have an international body of government do so? Wouldn't you agree that this is the same as amending our Constitution without going through the proper channels? Plus, what have we done is to basically transfer that power to a foreign entity. This is essentially how the members of the European Union lost much of their sovereignty. They kept agreeing to let the EU bureaucracy handle more and more areas that individual countries used to handle themselves. To find out how bad it has gotten, look up the European Commission. You'll find that the Commission comes up with new legislation and is in charge of enforcing it. Members are required to pass this legislation in their own governments or face consequences. The documentary, The Real Face of the EU, thoroughly exposed this. International commissions are dangerous entities. Did you know the USMCA agreement calls for the creation of a free trade commission? In Chapter 30, the agreement states the commission would be in charge of 6 key areas. And those 6 key areas we've included in a reprint from our New American magazine. So number 1, handling matters related to the implementation or operation of this agreement. Number 2, handling proposals to amend or modify this agreement. Number 3, supervise the work of committees, working groups, and other subsidiary bodies established under this agreement. Number 4, consider ways to further enhance trade and investment between the parties. Number 5, adopt and update the rules of procedure and code of conduct. And number 6, review the roster established under Article 31.8 every 3 years, and when appropriate, constitute a new roster. So in this reprint, we've encapsulated all 6 of those to mean the following: that the USMCA's Free Trade Commission can make changes to the agreement itself, implement changes to the agreement, change the rules by which it operates, approve who serves on its lower subordinate committees, and oversee the work of those committees like an international bureaucracy or government, all without the consent or approval of Congress. And each of those 16 committees takes away the constitutional duty of Congress to regulate trade. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a win for our country. This is not a good deal, and this is certainly not better than NAFTA. We are headed down the same path of those that are now trapped in the European Union. Do you realize that it has been more than 2 years since the Brexit vote? Those folks are nowhere near getting out of it. Now, we've discussed this before. The globalist takeover of free trade was exposed back in 1958 with the book entitled Mainline by U.S. Senator Wilson Malone. In his book, and many times on the Senate floor, he made the case that the objective of these free trade agreements was to strategically bind the United States in what Malone surprisingly described and accurately predicted in his 1958 book as the New World Order. Now let me read to you from an article about this posted at thenewamerican.com. It's rather lengthy, so please bear with me. The thesis which I present is that a pincers movement is now in operation both on the domestic and on the international scene, and that evidence shows that this movement bodes no good for us, Malone wrote in his book. The evidence is at times clear. Often it is so subtle as to require considerable application to be unearthed. The first jaw of the pincers is political. The second is economic. Regarding the first pincer, Malone pointed to the UN and the NATO pact, urging that the United States get out of both. However, it is the second pincer, the economic one, on which he focused much of his book upon. The first step in the pincers attack, according to Malone, was the transfer of Congress's power to levy tariffs to the executive branch in 1934. As Malone pointed out, authority for such levies was explicit in our Constitution. It was vested in the legislative branch, as written in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. For nearly a century, Congress used its constitutional tariff powers to protect American industry and investors through a flexible duty or tariff that was continually adjusted in order to make up the difference between the cost of doing business domestically and in the chief competitive nation for each product. The method by which Congress abdicated its constitutional tariff power was through the adoption of an act to amend the Tariff Act of 1930. This legislation presented a massive transfer of Congress's constitutional trade powers to the executive branch. The act empowered the president to negotiate new trade agreements without congressional approval. It gave the president the final decision on whether to reduce or raise tariffs no higher than 50% under the Tariff Act of 1930, more commonly known as the Smoot-Hawley Act. And President Franklin Roosevelt signed this into law on June 12, 1934. The second step in the pincers attack, as Malone further outlined in his book, was the executive branch's transfer of that already unconstitutional tariff powers to international authority. That international authority would take the form of the United Nations Organization, along with its specialized agencies of UNESCO, NATO, the International Bank and Fund, General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, which otherwise is known as GATT, and that later turned into the World Trade Organization, and the post-war Proposed International Trade Organization, or ITO. In both Congress and his book, Malone gave special attention to the ITO and GATT, recognizing them both as the principal international authorities in the second step of the age-old theory, serving as the economic jaws of the pincers movement. Malone traced the origins of the ITO and GATT to what we now know as deep state, a cadre of globalists, Council on Foreign Relations members, communists, and fellow travelers working toward the development of a one world government and economy. Next came the transfer of power. Citing the authority of the Trade Agreements Act of 1934, President Truman issued a presidential proclamation on December 16, 1947, announcing the United States' entry into GATT, effective January 1st of 1948. Moving forward, GATT would hold the power of tariffs once held by Congress. At this point, the transfer of power had become international, according to Malone. Now, folks, at this point, the seeds were sown for globalists to use trade as the basis for transferring a country's sovereignty piece by piece to unaccountable international organizations and regional bodies. Using a similar pincers strategy, the globalists were successful in building regional government using the bait of peace and trade among European countries. The European Coal and Steel Community was formed in the 1950s. Following this, the European Common Market, and finally, through a series of treaties, the European Union was officially born. All along the way, more and more regional bureaucracy was created to shift domestic power to this regional body. It had gotten so bad for the people of the UK regarding not being able to govern themselves that they are fighting to get out. So the vast empire that we fought for our independence in the late 1700s is now fighting for its own independence. And folks, this is why we must stop every one of these trade agreements. It's not a matter of a better deal. It's a matter of protecting our cherished sovereignty. If we lose the ability to govern ourselves, to control our economy, to make our own decisions, then we lose the ability to keep and protect our God-given rights. And no other country on earth protects a people's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness like the United States of America. If we lose that, there's nowhere else to go. So let's keep America the bastion of freedom that it was meant to be. Contact President Trump and Congress and tell them to stop the USMCA and get out of NAFTA. Then please, get 10 others to do so. If you need additional material to help convince them, we have all you need at jbs.org/NAFTA. Contact information and pre-written alerts are also at the page. Please do so today, and then consider joining other patriots at the John Birch Society.